The sun was sinking behind the rugged mesas, painting the desert sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. The wind carried whispers of old legends, dust swirling around the abandoned wooden structures of the small frontier town. It was a place where secrets clung to the corners of saloons, and the scent of leather and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. People came and went, but some stories refused to leave, clinging like the stubborn tumbleweeds that rolled endlessly across the plains. Among them was the story of a man who had everything: wealth, power, and a reputation that no one dared challenge. His name was Tokuda, a proud Apache whose very presence seemed to bend the world around him. His family had once been hunters, warriors, keepers of sacred traditions, and now he carried that legacy in a way few could understand. Tokuda's wealth was not just in gold or land, though he had both in abundance. It was in the respect he commanded, the fear and admiration that walked hand in hand whenever he entered a room. He lived by a single, unbreakable rule: never let anyone see the man behind the mask of strength. Though those around him, he was untouchable, a figure who could not be swayed by charm or flattery. But every rule has its breaking point, and the desert has a way of revealing truths even the proudest hearts try to hide. She appeared like a whisper in the evening wind, a stranger with eyes that held storms and sunlight all at once. Her name was Niali, and though she carried herself with quiet grace, there was a fire beneath her skin that no hardship could dim. She had traveled far, escaping the narrow chains of her past, seeking freedom in a place where she could simply breathe without judgment. The town had a way of swallowing outsiders, but Nayeli had a resilience that made even the dusty streets feel like they belonged to her. Their first meeting was not gentle. It was at the edge of Tokuda's sprawling estate, where the air smelled of cedar and smoke, and the horizon seemed endless. Nayeli had wandered too close to the boundaries, chasing the faint memory of a song her mother once hummed. Koda found her there, under the crimson sky, and something in her defiance caught his attention. It was dangerous, he knew, letting anyone into his world, and yet there was a pull he could not explain. "I don't go looking for trouble," Nayeli said, her voice steady, though her fingers trembled just slightly. "But trouble seems to have a way of finding me." Tokuda studied her, the corners of his mouth tilting ever so slightly. "Then perhaps trouble isn't always unwanted," he said, his voice low, deliberate, the weight of every word pressing against the desert stillness. He didn't smile, not really. His eyes, dark and piercing, held stories he would never tell, secrets that had been carved into him like the canyons surrounding the town. Days passed, and circumstances or perhaps fate continued to push them together. As state more than she intended, drawn by the unspoken promise that something extraordinary lingered beneath the surface of the man who never let anyone close. She noticed the way the sun caught the gold thread in his hair, the way his hand rested lightly on the hilt of his knife, even when danger wasn't near. There was a strength in him that felt unapproachable, yet she couldn't help but step closer, testing boundaries that most feared to even glance at. Then came the night that would change everything. The town had gathered for a celebration, lights flickering against the dark silhouettes of the adobe buildings. Music floated through the warm air, mingling with laughter and the occasional clatter of hooves against the dirt streets. Tokuda's presence was expected, respected, yet even in the midst of the crowd, he seemed apart, untouchable. Nayeli, dressed simply yet with a quiet elegance, found herself near him, her heart racing in ways she hadn't anticipated. He turned to her, gaze steady, and said words that made the wind seem to pause, as if the desert itself had leaned in to listen. "Pretend you're my wife," he said, a command wrapped in something softer, almost vulnerable, though his expression betrayed nothing. It wasn't a jest, nor was it an idle suggestion. It was a test, a challenge, a crossing of lines that had always been carefully drawn. Nayeli's pulse quickened. Why her? Why now? And what would it cost her to say yes, even for a moment? The air between them shifted, electric and dangerous, carrying the weight of unspoken rules and hidden desires. Tokuda had only ever broken one rule, and that had been a lifetime ago, a mistake that haunted him still. He had never allowed a single soul to see the man beneath the armor of wealth and fear, and yet here he was, standing close enough that the scent of cedar and sandalwood mixed with the desert air around them, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that threatened to unravel everything. Nayeli felt a shiver run through her. The idea of pretending, of stepping into a role that was not hers, should have been simple. Yet with Tokuda, nothing was simple. Everything carried meaning, danger, and consequence. The crowd faded around them, the music and chatter replaced by the quiet. Tense heartbeat of two people teetering on the edge of a moment that neither fully understood. Then it happened. One kiss, brief and impossibly charged, shattered the fragile walls they had both built. It was a kiss that whispered secrets, ignited fires, and yet warned of dangers too real to ignore. Tokoda's lips met hers with a restraint that made her knees weak, yet it carried a promise that made the air itself tremble. In that instant, everything changed. One rule, the only rule he had ever lived by, had been broken, and neither of them could look away from the consequences that now loomed like storm clouds over the desert plains. Neither spoke for a long moment, standing there in the glow of lanterns and firelight. The world seemed suspended, the silence heavy with possibility and peril. Nayali's mind raced with questions, fears, and a strange exhilaration she could not name. Takoda's jaw tightened, his usual composure slipping just slightly, betraying the man beneath the mask for the first time in years. And then, without warning, a shadow moved at the edge of the gathering. A figure, cloaked in mystery and intent, watched them both, unseen but unmistakably there. Takoda's eyes flicked toward it, dark and unreadable, and in that glance, Nayeli understood that the danger they faced was far from over. The kiss had broken a rule, but the shadow hinted at secrets and challenges that neither of them could yet imagine. The desert night deepened, stars blinking coldly above, and the wind carried the scent of dust, fire, and fate. Tokode and Nayeli stood together, linked by a single forbidden moment, knowing that everything they believed about control, power, and themselves was about to be tested. One rule broken, one kiss, and a future that neither could predict stretched out before them, wild and untamed as the plains around them. The shadow lingered at the edge of the celebration, barely visible under the flickering lantern light. Takoda's eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body tensing as though he could read the intent of the stranger without a word being spoken. Nayeli felt it too, a cold prickle crawling along her spine, and instinctively stepped closer to him. She didn't fully understand the danger, but she trusted her intuition, a rare trait that Takoda noticed immediately. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The words were simple, but there was a weight to them that made her heart beat faster. Takoda had never asked anyone to be near him in such a way. Usually, people either followed his orders without question, or they kept their distance, too afraid of the power that radiated from him. Nayeli had crossed that threshold without even trying, and now the world seemed to hold its breath around them. The town itself had an uneasy calm, the revelry on the surface hiding tensions that ran deep. Tokoda's wealth and influence weren't just from land or gold. They were rooted in old alliances and ancient feuds. Families from neighboring territories still remembered the old battles, the blood spilled over respect, and the grudges that lasted generations. Every gesture, every glance carried meaning. Nayeli was beginning to understand that stepping into Takoda's world was like stepping onto a chessboard where every move could be deadly. Takoda led her away from the crowd, down a narrow path lined with mesquite and sage. The sounds of laughter and music faded behind them, replaced by the quiet sighing of the wind through the desert canyons. Here, in the shadow of the cliffs, Takoda felt more himself. Away from prying eyes, the mask of power softened just slightly, though the intensity in his gaze never wavered. "You don't know the half of it yet," he said, his hand brushing briefly against hers as they walked. Nayeli noticed the contact, fleeting but deliberate, and felt a surge of something she could not name. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an awareness of the depth of this man's world. A world filled with rules she might never fully understand. Takoda paused at a rock outcropping that overlooked the desert plains, the wind tugging at his dark hair. He turned to her, eyes scanning the horizon as though he could see both the present and the past, laid out like a map before him. "There are forces here," he began, his tone low and measured, "that do not forgive weakness. People who would use any mistake, any moment of distraction, to take what is ours, my family, my land, the things I've built. They are all in danger if I do not remain vigilant." Nayeli nodded, absorbing his words. She had always thought danger was something distant, something that happened in stories or on the other side of town. But standing here with Takoda, She realized that danger could be close, almost intimate, like a shadow following every step. Yet there was something else, a thread of trust weaving between them despite the uncertainty. "I've lived by rules my whole life," Tokoda continued. "Rules handed down from those before me. Rules that protected me, kept me strong." And yet, he paused, a shadow crossing his features. There are moments when even the strongest rules are challenged. Moments that can change everything in a heartbeat. His eyes found hers, dark and steady. Tonight is one of those moments. Nayeli's mind raced. The kiss they had shared weighed on her thoughts, both intoxicating and frightening. One small gesture had already shaken the foundations of Tokoda's carefully controlled world, and she couldn't imagine the repercussions. But she also felt an undeniable pull toward him, a curiosity she could neither deny nor explain. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of footsteps along the dry earth. Tokoda stiffened instantly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Nayeli felt her own pulse quicken, but she stayed silent, trusting him to handle whatever came next. From the shadows emerged a rider, a man cloaked in dust and darkness, face hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat. His horse's hooves barely made a sound, but the presence was unmistakable. Tokoda's jaw tightened as he studied the newcomer. "Who is he?" Nayeli whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "A reminder," Tokoda said, eyes never leaving the rider, "of past debts, of dangers that never sleep." His hand rested lightly on Nayeli's back, steadying her as though he could shield her from more than just physical harm. The rider paused a few yards away, watching them with an intensity that was unnerving. There was no recognition in Tokoda's gaze, only wariness. Whatever this man wanted, it was not simple. Nayeli looked at Tokoda, sensing layers to him that she hadn't seen before. He was not just a man of wealth or power. He was a man who carried history in his bones, who'd fought battles unseen and survived forces most people would fear even to name. And now, in the desert twilight, she realized that she had stepped into that history, into the center of a storm that had been brewing long before she arrived. Tokoda's voice broke the silence again. "This isn't a challenge for you," he said. "It's not your fight." But the edge in his tone suggested he was testing himself as much as the stranger. "Yet if you are to stay near me, you must understand everything. Here is a risk. Nothing is as it seems, and everyone has an agenda." Nayeli swallowed, steadying herself. Her life had taught her resilience, taught her to survive on her own, but she sensed that survival here would be different. The rules of this land were ancient, written in sand and blood, and she had no map. Still, there was a part of her that refused to retreat, that wanted to see just how far the threads of fate would pull her into Tokoda's world. The rider finally spoke, voice low and deliberate. "Tokoda." The single word carried weight, authority, and a quiet threat. Tokoda's eyes narrowed, but he did not move immediately. There was a moment of pause, pregnant with tension, where history and destiny seemed to collide in the wind-swept desert. Nayeli felt it too, a pressure in the air that made her chest tighten. This was more than a stranger delivering a message. This was a reckoning, a test that could unravel everything Tokoda had built. Tokoda took a step forward, the shadows of the cliffs stretching long across the desert floor. "We meet again," he said, voice calm but deadly. There was an undercurrent of warning, a silent declaration that he was ready for whatever challenge the rider represented. Nayeli stayed close, heart pounding, aware that the moment they faced was larger than either of them alone. The wind shifted again, stirring the dust into ghostly shapes. Nayeli felt the pull of the desert, the weight of history, and the tension of a world where one mistake could cost everything. The rider's gaze flicked to her briefly, and in that instant, she understood that her presence here was no accident. Tokoda's life, the empire he had built, and the fragile trust between them had been drawn into something far larger, far more dangerous than either of them could yet imagine. And then the rider spoke again, voice carrying a note of finality. "You know why I am here. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." Tokoda's eyes burned, but he remained silent. Nayeli felt the pulse of anticipation the moment before the storm, where every heartbeat counted. One rule broken, one kiss, and now a shadow from the past threatening to engulf everything. She clutched the edge of her coat, steadying herself against the unknown, knowing that the desert had more stories to tell, and some of them were far from finished. The night deepened, the stars cold and distant above them, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Tokoda and Naeli stood side by side, caught in a moment suspended between history, desire, and danger. Neither spoke, yet every glance, every shift, carried meaning. The rider waited, the wind whispered, and the desert watched. What happened next would change everything, but no one could yet see how. The rider's presence unsettled the desert night. A ripple of tension spreading through the wind as though the mesas themselves were holding their breath. Tokoda's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing against the hilt of his knife without drawing it. Naeli could feel the quiet storm rolling off him, a mixture of control, caution, and a simmering fire that refused to be hidden. She had seen flashes of it before, in the way he moved, the way he commanded the world around him. But this was something more. This was a challenge, one that could undo everything. The rider shifted, the horse stamping once against the hard-packed earth. "Tokoda," he said again, more insistently this time, "you cannot ignore what has been set in motion. People are talking, allies are questioning loyalty, and those who wish to take your land are already moving." Takeda's eyes darkened, storm clouds reflected in their depth. "I do not take threats lightly," he said, voice low and steady. "And yet words alone do not scare me. Show me your proof, or leave." The rider did not answer immediately. Steady dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, the dust rising around him like a curtain. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the air of someone accustomed to authority. Yet there was an intensity in his gaze that unsettled even Tokoda. "Proof?" he asked. "You know better than anyone that in this land, proof comes in blood and action, and what I have seen cannot be ignored. There are whispers of betrayal, Tokoda, and you are standing at the center of it." Naeli felt the tension coil around her like a rattlesnake ready to strike. She had always known that Tokoda's life was dangerous, but danger had a new meaning now. It was no longer about survival in the desert or navigating the town's gossip. This was about unseen enemies, old debts, and the fragile trust that could shatter in a single moment. She glanced at Tokoda, searching for any sign of uncertainty, but his expression remained unreadable, a mask honed over years of battles she could barely imagine. "You speak in riddles," Tokoda said finally, his voice a low growl. "If there is a threat, name it. Ow. Do not cloak it in shadows and whispers. I do not fear what I cannot see, but I do fear what is hidden and allowed to fester." The rider nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Tokoda's words. "Very well," he said, voice steady. "There is a man calling himself Kale, who has been making arrangements to seize portions of your land. He is clever, well-funded, and patient. He has allies among people you consider friends. He knows about your attachments. He knows about Naeli." Naeli felt her stomach twist. Her name, spoken like a weapon, sent a shiver down her spine. She had stepped into Tokoda's world without fully understanding the consequences, and now her very presence was a threat. Tokoda's eyes flicked to her, dark and sharp, a silent warning. She understood without words whatever game was unfolding. It involved her in ways she could not yet control. Kale Tokoda repeated, the name heavy on his tongue. He studied the rider, assessing every angle, every possibility. "And you are certain he acts alone?" The rider shook his head. "No. He has accomplices, hidden ones. Some are within the town, some on the outskirts, and others, it's closer than you imagine. He moves carefully, Tokoda. But he moves." The desert wind stirred again, carrying with it the scent of mesquite and sage. Naeli could hear the faint rustle of animals in the distance, the steady beating of hooves on dust, and the quiet hum of the earth beneath them. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement loaded with potential danger. She felt a mixture of fear and fascination, drawn to the intensity of Tokoda's world, even as it threatened to consume her. Tokoda's mind raced, weighing possibilities. Kale's name was not unfamiliar. Whispers of his ambition had reached Tokoda before, carried on the wind or through the cautious mouths of travelers. Yet the knowledge that Kale had moved closer, that he had threaded himself into the lives of people Tokoda trusted, was a different matter entirely. It was a challenge that required strategy, patience, and a recklessness that Tokoda rarely allowed himself. "We need allies," Tokoda said at last, his tone steady but sharp. "People I can trust without question. We need to watch every move Kale makes. Nothing escapes. Me not his words, not his actions, not his intentions. His eyes flicked to Nayeli again. And you must remain close. If he targets me through you, I cannot afford mistakes. Nayela's heart thudded in her chest. She had not expected to be a part of this battle, yet here she was, central to a conflict that could decide the fate of the land, of Tokoda's legacy, and perhaps of her own life. She nodded, understanding the weight of what he asked, and in that moment, she realized there was no turning back. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the town, Kale was already stirring the web of alliances that would place him at the center of the coming storm. He moved with quiet calculation, speaking to merchants, ranchers, and those who sought influence. His smile was easy, his words smooth, but beneath it lay ambition sharp as a blade. He had learned much about Tokoda, about the man's pride, his rules, and the vulnerability that came with attachments. Nayeli's name, whispered in certain corners, was enough to unsettle even the most disciplined of hearts. Back at the cliff's edge, Tokoda and Nayeli watched the horizon, the darkening sky mirroring the tension in their minds. The desert was silent now, as though it too waited for the first move. Takeda's hand brushed hers once more, brief and grounding, a reminder that even amidst danger, there was connection, trust, and a fragile human bond. "Do you understand?" he asked quietly. "The stakes are higher than you realize. This is more than wealth or power. It's history, pride, survival, and every choice we make will have consequences." Nayeli nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had always believed herself strong, capable of weathering storms, but this was a storm unlike any other. One that threatened not only her life but the life of someone she was beginning to care for, someone whose rules and heart were entwined with danger in ways she could barely grasp. The rider, sensing that his message had been received, mounted his horse again, the leather creaking under him. "I will return with information," he said. "And remember, Tokoda, shadows move faster than light." With that, he rode into the night, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Tokoda watched him go, jaw tight, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. He turned to Nayeli, the desert wind tugging at his hair and coat. "This is only the beginning," he said. "Kale will test us, probe us, and use every advantage he has. We must be ready." Nayeli's thoughts raced. The kiss, the shadowed rider, the threat of Kalal of it formed a web she could not untangle. And yet, in the midst of fear, there was a strange exhilaration. She was part of something larger now, something dangerous, thrilling, and impossible to ignore. The desert night stretched endlessly before them, filled with whispers, shadows, and secrets. Tokoda's hand remained lightly on her back, steadying her, guiding her, and reminding her that in this world, connection could be as vital as courage. But the tension was far from over. Kale's moves were unseen yet inevitable. The threat of betrayal hung heavy, and the fragile trust between Tokoda and Nayeli was only beginning to form. Above them, the stars glittered coldly, distant and unyielding. Below, the desert held its breath. Between the two of them, a bond was forming, forged in moments of risk, moments of unspoken desire, and moments of sheer survival. The rules had been broken, the first kiss shared. And now the game had begun, one that neither Tokoda nor Nayeli could yet control. One that promised danger, passion, and the shadows of history converging in a single, unstoppable force. The night had grown colder, the desert wind slicing across the plains with a bite that made the hair on Nayeli's arms stand on end. Tokoda led her along a narrow ridge overlooking his property, the moon casting long, sharp shadows that danced like specters across the rocky ground. Every sense was alert, the sound of distant hooves, the rustle of desert brush, the faint glimmer of movement far below. The danger was no longer distant. It was immediate, pressing, alive. "Kale won't wait," Tokoda said, voice low, eyes scanning every shadow. "He's patient, yes, but he's reckless too. And desperation makes a man dangerous." He paused, letting the words settle. "He's already testing our defenses. Tonight, he will see just how far he can push." Nayeli's heart beat rapidly, a mixture of fear and adrenaline coursing through her. She had never been this close to a threat so calculated, so personal. And yet, there was a thrill in standing beside Tokoda, feeling the unspoken trust that bound them, even as every instinct told her to run. She had never known a man like him, strong, commanding, and yet not unfeeling. A man whose every decision carried the weight of history, pride, and survival. They crept down the ridge toward a small, hidden cabin, one that Dakota had built as a safe place long before Nayeli arrived. Its wooden walls were weathered and strong, a testament to careful planning and foresight. Here they would make their stand, observe the movements of Cale and his allies, and prepare for whatever strike might come first. As they entered the cabin, Takeda's eyes caught a flicker of movement outside. He stepped silently to the window, hand resting on the hilt of his knife, and peered into the darkness. Nayeli followed, her pulse racing, as she tried to see what he saw. There was a figure, just beyond the edge of the property, moving with the cautious precision of someone who had studied their terrain. Cale's influence had already begun to creep into the town, and every step this shadow took toward them was a reminder of the stakes. "We cannot afford mistakes," Tokuda whispered. "One misstep, and everything falls apart." His eyes flicked to Nayeli, dark and unreadable. "This includes you. Must stay close, listen, and be ready for anything." Nayeli nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of her coat. The air in the cabin seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. She could feel Takeda's tension, the rigid control he usually maintained, slipping only slightly under the pressure of the looming threat. And beneath it all, there was a quiet thread of connection between them. Fragile, yet undeniable, forged through shared danger and unspoken understanding. Outside, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying the scent of dust, sage, and the faint tang of gunpowder. Every sound was magnified, the distant call of a coyote, the crunch of footsteps over stone, the flutter of a bird startled into the night. Takoda and Nayeli moved in silence, each aware of the other, each attuned to the rhythm of survival in a world where a single misjudgment could mean death. Hours passed like this, a tense waiting game. Tokuda's mind was a storm of possibilities, every scenario calculated, every risk measured. Cale was cunning, but Tokuda had lived long enough, fought enough to know the patterns of men driven by greed and pride. Yet even with experience on his side, there was a gnawing uncertainty. The shadow of betrayal could come from anywhere, even from those he considered allies. Nayeli's thoughts wandered to Cale, the man who had set this chain of events in motion. She had never met him directly, but she could feel his presence, his ambition threading through the town like an invisible web. Every whisper, every hurried glance in the marketplace, every shadow lingering too long, spoke of his reach. And now, standing here with Tokuda, she realized just how deeply she was entangled in the conflict. "Do you trust me?" Tokuda asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the stillness. His eyes searched hers, piercing and unrelenting. "Yes," Nayeli said, without hesitation. "With everything I have," he nodded, a brief flicker of something softer crossing his features before the mask of control returned.
"That's good."
"Because if you falter, Cale will not hesitate. He will use anything, anyone, to break me." The wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound from the distance, a whistle, low and deliberate, the kind that carried across the desert plains. Dakota stiffened, moving to the cabin door with fluid precision. Nayeli followed every nerve on edge as they peered into the night. There, just beyond the trees, movement began. Shadows coalesced into figures, masked men, riding fast and silent, their intent unmistakable. Cale had made his first move. Dakota's hand found Nayeli's, gripping it briefly. "Stay close," he whispered. "No one leaves this ridge tonight without knowing who they face." The figures drew nearer, dust rising in faint clouds beneath their hooves. Takeda's eyes swept over them, calculating, anticipating. He could see the skill in their movements, the discipline of trained men, but he could also sense their weaknesses. One misstep, one hesitation, and the advantage would shift. Nayeli felt her breath catch. The adrenaline was intense, almost overwhelming, yet she refused to look away. Every instinct told her to trust Dakota, to follow his lead, and she did, feeling the steady beat of his pulse against her side, the weight of his presence grounding her in a world suddenly filled with peril. The first clash was inevitable. Dakota moved swiftly, taking cover behind a rock outcropping, signaling to Nayeli to stay low. Arrows whistled through the air, and the thud of hooves echoed across the ridge. Dust, shadow, and the sharp tang of danger filled the night. Takoda's movements were precise, each decision deliberate, each action measured. He was in his element, yet the presence of Nayeli added a new layer of tension he had not expected. She was not just a witness, she was part of the equation now, part of the risk, and part of the strategy. One of Kale's men emerged from the shadows, aiming directly for the cabin. Takoda's knife flashed, a blur in the moonlight, and the man went down silently, leaving only a faint rustle as he hit the ground. Nahel's heart pounded, her eyes wide, yet she did not falter. Takoda had trained her in the basics, had shown her how to stay alive in moments of extreme danger, and now it mattered more than ever. The battle of shadows continued across the ridge, the night alive with tension. Takoda moved with unmatched skill, but Kale's forces were relentless, coordinated, and clever. Each time one threat was neutralized, another emerged, testing their resolve, their strategy, and their endurance. Nayeli stayed close, following instructions. Watching, learning, and feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Finally, a pause settled over the ridge, a quiet that felt almost unnatural. Takoda and Nayeli crouched behind the rocks, breaths shallow, listening. The desert had grown eerily still, the only sound the wind and the faint shuffle of movement far below. Somewhere, Kale's shadow loomed, waiting, planning his next move. Takoda's eyes met Nayeli's, and in that gaze, there was a mixture of exhaustion, resolve, and something else, an unspoken promise. "We're not finished," he said quietly. "This is only the beginning. Kale will come again, stronger, more dangerous. We are ready. We will be ready." Nayeli nodded, feeling a surge of determination she had never known. The stakes were higher than ever, the danger closer than she could have imagined, yet standing here with Takoda, she felt that together they could face whatever came next. Above them, the stars shone, cold and distant, indifferent to human struggle. Below, the desert waited, silent, vast, and unforgiving. Between them, a bond had formed, fragile, tested, and strengthened in the crucible of shared danger. The night held its breath, waiting for the next move, the next challenge, the next test of courage, trust, and loyalty. And somewhere in the darkness, Kale watched, patient and calculating, knowing that the battle was far from over. The ridge, the cabin, and the desert itself had become a stage for a story of power, love, and survival. Every heartbeat, every glance, every whispered instruction mattered. The climax was coming, the storm approaching, and neither Takoda nor Nayeli could yet know how it would end. The first light of dawn stretched across the desert, soft gold brushing the mesas and igniting the plains in a warm glow. The battle of the previous night had ended, though not without leaving its mark scorched earth, where Kale's men had tested their luck, and footprints that would fade in the morning wind. Takoda stood at the ridge, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert as ever, yet a calm had settled over him that hadn't been there before. Nayeli approached, her steps quiet but purposeful, carrying a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We made it," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the whisper of the morning wind. Takoda didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, dark eyes taking in the shift in her demeanor, the strength she had shown, a courage that had surprised him more than once. Finally, he nodded, a small, approving movement. "Yes," he said, "we made it, and Kale. He knows now that he cannot challenge us so easily." The rider who had warned them the night before had returned with word that Kale had retreated, regrouping far from Takoda's territory. His attempt to sow discord had failed, and the alliances he had relied upon were unraveling. Takoda's vigilance, combined with Nayeli's courage, had tipped the scales in their favor. Yet it wasn't just strategy or skill that had won the day, was the bond that had formed between them, connection forged in the crucible of shared danger. Nayeli stepped closer, her hand brushing against Takoda's. "You were incredible," she said. "I've never seen anyone move like that. You're more than I imagined." Takoda's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "And you stood beside me when it mattered most. That takes a courage I haven't seen in many." His gaze softened, the mask of power and untouchability slipping just enough to reveal the man beneath the man who had lived by one strict rule and found it challenged by a single moment, a single kiss. The sun rose higher, casting light on the land that Takoda had fought so hard to protect. The town below stirred to life. unaware of the shadowed battle that had raged during the night. Merchants opened their shops, children ran across dusty streets, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with the desert air. Life, as relentless as the desert wind, continued. But Tokoda knew the balance had shifted. He had faced danger, survived it, and learned something invaluable, not just about enemies outside, but about the vulnerabilities within himself. Nayeli's eyes followed him, curious and tentative. "And your rule?" she asked quietly, referencing the one principle he had never broken, the one you told me was unshakable. Tokoda's expression was thoughtful, the weight of years evident in the set of his jaw. "It was a rule to protect myself, to prevent anyone from seeing what was soft, fragile, or uncertain." He took a deep breath, the wind carrying it across the ridge. "But rules are meant to guide us, not chain us. And sometimes a single moment, a single person can change everything." He turned toward her eyes, dark and sincere. "You changed everything, Nayeli. One kiss, one act of trust. And the rule no longer holds the same meaning." Nayeli felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet reassurance that the dangers of the past night had forged something stronger than fear. It was trust, courage, and a connection neither had anticipated, yet both now understood. She reached for his hand, letting it rest in hers, and for the first time, Tokoda allowed himself to relax, even slightly, under the weight of companionship. The town below began to stir with news of Kale's retreat. Whispers carried through the streets, some in fear, others in relief, but none fully understood the events of the night. Tokoda's influence had not been challenged, and his control over the land and its people had strengthened. Yet he did not let pride blind him. He knew vigilance would always be necessary, that history carried lessons of betrayal and resilience. But he also knew that today he had survived not just with strategy, but with heart. Nayeli laughed softly, a sound that cut through the desert stillness like a bell. "You're thinking too much again," she said. "Even men like you can take a breath sometimes." Tokoda's eyes flicked to her, a glimmer of amusement breaking the intensity. "Okay, perhaps," he said, voice low but warm. "But only when I know the world is safe for a moment. Only when the person beside me is worth it." The bond between them had grown beyond survival. In the night's darkness, trust had been forged. In the battle, courage had been tested. And in the quiet moments of dawn, understanding had emerged. They were no longer just a man and a woman in the desert. They were partners, allies, and something more, bound by shared danger and unwavering trust. As they descended the ridge toward the town, the air was filled with the quiet optimism of a world renewed. Tokoda and Nayeli moved with purpose, side by side, ready to face whatever future awaited them. There was still work to be done, alliances to rebuild, territories to secure, and lessons to carry forward, but for now, there was a sense of peace, hard-earned and fragile, yet undeniable. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the resilience required to navigate it. Tokoda had faced Kale, the rider, and the shadows of past challenges, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and willing to embrace the unexpected. Nayeli had proven herself brave, resourceful, and capable of standing beside a man whose life had been built on rules, only to see those rules challenged by trust and courage. They reached the town square, where the first merchants were opening their stalls, and children's laughter carried through the streets. The sun now fully illuminated the adobe buildings, casting the town in a warm glow. Tokoda's gaze softened as he observed the life he had fought to protect, the simple joys, the enduring routines, the unspoken stories of generations. And beside him, Nayeli's hand in his reminded him that life, even amidst danger and betrayal, could still hold moments of beauty, hope, and connection. "Do you feel it?" Nayeli asked, tilting her head slightly, eyes scanning the town. "The calm. The world seems lighter somehow." Tokoda nodded, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Yes," he said, "and it's because we faced it together. Kale, the shadows, the threats, they tested us. But they also reminded us of what matters: trust, loyalty, and the courage to step forward even when the outcome is uncertain." They walked slowly through the square, side by side, drawing curious glances from townspeople who sensed something different about this pair. They carried a quiet authority, a presence that commanded respect without a word. and though the town could not yet understand the full story, it was clear that Takeda's rule, once rigid, unbroken, had evolved, shaped by one moment, one kiss, and the unyielding bravery of a woman who refused to retreat. By the time the sun rose fully above the horizon, the world seemed renewed, the desert winds soft, and the shadows of the previous night fading like a distant memory. Dakota and Nayeli paused at the edge of the town, hands still intertwined, hearts aligned, and minds clear in a way that only shared trials could bring. They had faced threats, betrayal, and uncertainty, yet emerged stronger. Their connection deepened, and their purpose renewed. Dakota turned to Nayeli, eyes dark but warm. "We survived," he said simply. "Not because of rules alone, but because we trusted each other. And that makes all the difference." Nayeli smiled, feeling a quiet joy she had not known she could feel. "Then let's face the future together," she said. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it side by side." He nodded, a final sense of resolve settling over him. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time in years, Dakota felt that he could truly breathe, that the weight of rules, legacy, and danger could coexist with hope, trust, and even love. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, the sun warming their faces, and the town below began its day, unaware of the battles that had been fought and won. But Dakota and Nayeli knew, in their hearts, that the trials had shaped them, united them, and prepared them for whatever lay ahead. The shadow of Kale was gone for now, but the lessons remained. Trust, courage, and the willingness to break a rule for the right reason had reshaped not only Dakota's life, but theirs together. And as they walked through the town, side by side, the desert behind them, and the promise of a future ahead, they understood something vital. Even in a world built on rules, danger, and shadows, moments of connection, bravery, and trust could create a life worth protecting. One kiss had shattered a rule, but it had built a bond stronger than any danger they could face. And for Dakota and Nayeli, that was enough to face the world anew.